pay us an indemnity because we helped, okay? So, Open Door shows our interest in China. Now, we're back to Cuba. Again, we're sort of jumping around the globe, but what I want you to understand about Cuba is we do perform some amazing services. We get rid of yellow fever, which is no small feat at all. And a name you should know is Leonard Wood. The other name you should know is Walter Reed, if only because that's the most famous military hospital, Walter Reed Hospital. But just true to our promise, we get out. We said in the Teller Amendment we wouldn't take it over, and the Platt Amendment finishes that up. But the Platt Amendment's got serious strings attached. It says, hey, Cuba, remember, we helped get you free, so we're going to call certain shots. So you can't make treaties with other nations, and if you get yourself into economic trouble, we're going to come back, and just to make sure, we're going to leave what will later become Guantanamo Bay. If you haven't seen it, see A Few Good Men. It's a great movie, but it has no real relevance to this right now, okay? So, the amendment makes Cuba a protectorate, and then very soon Cuba's going to have its own independence, and then obviously in 1959 with the rise of Fidel Castro, it's going to become a very, very different relationship, okay? So that's sort of our expansion that we've done around the world. But we still got that one final piece of Mahan's plan, which is we need a canal. And again, if we can't get what we want, what do? We sort of create a war or some pretense to get ourselves in. In this particular case, we couldn't exactly buy ourselves the canal. We didn't know where it would go. And then we found that Panama was going to be the best place. Problem is, Panama was part of Colombia. Colombia wanted much more money in order to get this canal. So then we helped the Panamanians fight off the Colombians. And then as soon as Panama's independent, they sign off on the deal, and then we have our canal. Now, of course, the canal doesn't happen like that, but it is going to be one of the great sort of achievements of Teddy Roosevelt's presidency, and then he's rolling over in his grave when, much later on, James Earl Carter from the state of Georgia gives up the Panama Canal. And if you guys are in chapter 33, of course, you know that. My class does not know that yet. So, Roosevelt corollary, going back to the Monroe Doctrine, is this idea of non-colonization, non-intervention. You European powers don't go here, we won't come over there, which is laughable because we had no ability to go over there, but we, again, were teenagers essentially at the time, we're puffing out our chests. Now, we got some problems in our neck of the woods, particularly the Dominican. They get in trouble financially. And our concern is that if countries get in trouble financially, European powers are going to come over to collect that money, and if European powers are coming over to collect that money, they violate the Monroe Doctrine, so we got a problem. So, we got a corollary. Again, sort of an addition. The idea of the corollary is we will manage the financial affairs of our Latin American sort of kids that we're babysitting, and we'll make it so they're stable. Now, of course, we thought that was great, but most of Latin America saw this as far too paternalistic, and there go the Yankees swinging their big stick and not really thinking about what's going on with us. So we decided that we would take control, and that's the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Now, U.S. diplomacy in this era goes from Teddy with his big stick going in with the corollary to William Howard Taft and his girth and his mustache, and he believed in what's known as dollar diplomacy. Dollar diplomacy is we will go to places that are of economic interest to us, and we'll use sort of investment to tell them what to do. And frankly speaking, that got us involved more in Latin America, got us investing in Latin America, but it's going to be repudiated by Woodrow Wilson, who comes in and says money shouldn't dictate this, morality should. Now, please remember that Woodrow Wilson, father was a preacher, a good Christian from Virginia, said, you know what? It's all about sort of helping other people, and that should dictate, not money, not greed. And then he sent our people to Latin America as well. Okay, so again, whether it's money or whether it's morality, we still end up in Latin America sort of taking care of our own backyard. Okay. Now, we're going to switch to the progressives. So we had ourselves the Spanish-American War. We got ourselves the Philippines, which we're later going to give up in 46. We got ourselves Cuba, which we're going to give up. We got Puerto Rico, which we're going to keep. We got Guam, which we're going to keep. We got Hawaii, which we're going to keep. So we're going to switch. And now we're sort of positioning ourselves right at the same time, early 1900s. And I want you to understand what the point of the progressives were, or was, I guess. The idea here is not, these people are not radicals by any stretch of the imagination. They want the government to do more. That is not radical by any means. And in some ways, it's a little bit conservative. They don't want to go out and do it themselves. They see the government as something that's important and has been underutilized. So what they say is, we used to have a farming culture. Now we've got cities full of people from a bunch of different places, and in often cases they're poor, they're being exploited. We want to make sure that they are in better shape. So we see that business has taken over, certainly a post-Reconstruction idea. We see that rich are getting very, very rich, the Cornelius Vanderbilts, the Andrew Carnegies, the J.P. Morgans, and then how the other half are living, certainly with Jacob Riis. We see these problems at the railroad strike, we see it at Homestead, we see it at Haymarket, we see it at Pullman, okay? And then we've got political machines, most famously New York City, Tammany Hall, Boss Tweed. And then, of course, you've got this missionary spirit, sort of we know best, this social gospel. Namely, the government is not doing enough, so we want to come in and actually help minister to these people. Please do not confuse social Darwinism, which is some people are destined to be poor, some people are destined to be great, with the social gospel, which is that the church needs to help people, and don't confuse that with the gospel of wealth, which is Andrew Carnegie's idea that the rich need to act as sort of trustees for the poor. Again, we've got a bunch of gospels and a bunch of socials. Okay? So, progressivism and its champions. You've got the muckrakers. The muckrakers, as labeled by Teddy Roosevelt, their idea was to rake the muck and create dirt, but they didn't propose solutions. Their goal was, if we put it out there, all of a sudden people will see how bad it is and government has to act. And famously, we see Jacob Riis, a photographer, going throughout the slums, the tenements, the dumbbells, and oftentimes posing street urchins in very awkward poses to make them look even worse than they are. So you've got how the other half lives, which is both writing and pictures. You've got Ida Tarbell, whose father had been burned by, the Rockefellers and Standard Oil, and she's going to try to expose him. You've got Lincoln Steffens, who is writing all about corrupt city governments in a book that doesn't really get mentioned in Tyndall, but you should remember it. There's only one man who can defeat an octopus. One man. Chuck Norris, of course. So that is how to remember that it is Norris who writes about the octopus, which is the railroads, which have their tentacles throughout all of the land, and particularly are strangling the farmers. So you've got four muckrakers right here. But perhaps the most famous of all, and she was from right here, most famous woman in America at the time, Jane Addams, who was part of a vanguard of women, upper middle class women who've gone to college and find that they have nothing really to do. So following the example that she'd seen in the slums of London at Toynbee Hall, she comes up with this idea of sort of the American settlement house. And it's going to be right here at the Hull Mansion in Chicago, in an area that is very poor, an area that has many, many different types of immigrants there. And with a bunch of university-educated women, she's going to create basically a social center, a community center. Now, at least if you're in my class, people would write in their essays, the residents of Hull House. No one resided there, actually. The only people that were residents were actually the middle-class women who volunteered there. So you didn't stay there unless it was an emergency or fleeing an abusive husband or something like that. But what they did do is they taught classes, they had daycare, they had the city's first playground, they had free lectures. It really was a place for both social services as well as enrichment. And invariably, people like Jane Addams, and I want to say her name was Elizabeth Gates Starr, who also founded it, found themselves, along with Florence Kelley, involved in key social issues, okay? Fighting against child labor, for women's suffrage, healthcare reform, immigration policy. It's hard not to work in that environment and not get yourself involved. And she is considered, and Hull House is considered, the beginning of the social work movement, okay? Certainly Jane Addams, perhaps the most important woman of this movement. Now, civil rights is an odd one because we don't necessarily always associate civil rights with the progressives, but the name, of course, that you need to know is W.E.B. Du Bois. Now remember, W.E.B. Du Bois is counter to Booker T. Washington, whereas Booker T. Washington is a gradualist and accommodationist. The Atlanta Compromise, Tuskegee Institute, let us work with our hands. Booker T. Washington says, our talented 10th is ready right now. Okay. Economically and politically, we can compete with any whites. And so you're going to see that sort of ideology manifests itself first in what's known as the Niagara Movement, because they met at Niagara Falls, and then it's going to become the NAACP, which still is the premier civil rights organization in America, and the NAACP will fight against segregation in the federal government. So that's really Wilson's lone black mark, no pun intended there, on his progressive record. And then, of course, the famous or infamous Birth of a Nation, which really sort of glamorized the KKK, which is shown in the White House. There's some serious protests of that as well. I don't believe Tyndall mentioned this at all, but it's also the rise of the ADL, which is Anti-Defamation League, which is fighting anti-Semitism. There's a reason that anti-Semitism is on the rise. If you recall, during this era, the immigrants that are coming to the country are generally coming from South and Eastern Europe, particularly a number of Jews who are facing major discrimination when they come here. So I haven't seen many questions that relate to the ADL, but it's certainly helpful to know that one there. Now, Florence Kelley is another name you need to know, as she fought against child labor. Her work with the National Consumer League and the National Child Labor Committee got states to make the rules about child labor, but they didn't actually sort of enforce them. So here's what we need to know, and these are two famous cases. There's a third that's a little less important. Lochner versus New York. The case of Lochner versus New York doesn't actually help laborers. It hurts laborers. The state of New York said that you can only work so many hours. And so the businesses appealed to the Supreme Court and said, wait a second, we don't like that limit. The Supreme Court said, you're right. The state cannot impose any limit on how long people work, because that would take away their right to make as much money as they want. Okay? So in this particular case, it's bad for labor. But the next case you want to know is Miller versus Oregon. Very, very good for labor and for women. Because what it said was, because women are special, both psychologically and physically, they can have a limit to their day. Now, it actually said sex discrimination is okay, and women were fine with it because now they weren't going to be abused and exploited. Now, following this case, which was argued by Louis Brandeis, who will become the first Jewish member of the Supreme Court, they're going to use what's known as the Brandeis Brief, okay, to argue that both men and women should be protected for the 10-hour day. So you start with women, then you're going to get to men as well. So very important here for labor. Obviously, Lochner versus New York doesn't help them at all, okay? Now, Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. Triangle Shirtwaist Fire is a tragic tale of women who are trapped in a shirtwaist factory, and they can't get out because the exits are locked and the fire escapes don't work. Now, the important part here is in their death, sort of in their martyrdom, the state of New York will come up with safety as well as workers' comp. This is not national, but many states are going to follow sort of what comes out of this tragedy right here. So again, you don't see national workplace safety per se, but you're going to start seeing it on the state level. Again, these are all ways that the government is serving as an agency of social welfare. Okay? Now, we have seen, going all the way back, we've seen groups like the Knights of Labor, the sort of all-inclusive, skilled and unskilled, women, African Americans, everybody but non-producers. And they go by the wayside as a result of Haymarket. You're going to see basically what we call Knights of Labor Part 2, the Wobblies, the international workers of the world who believe in one big union that is going to have skilled and unskilled together. And unlike the Knights of Labor, who officially were against picketing, these guys don't care. They'll not only picket, they'll go for international sabotage, industrial sabotage, and of course during World War I, and you can remember it this way, okay, IWW, WW1, okay, if you remember it that way, IWW,